So, first of all, I'd like to introduce myself again, Daniel Frome, Senior Business Product Analyst. And the most important thing, probably, I wanted to sort of highlight in my first animation is the emails, right? Like our email domains change. You can still email me at ESD Spectrum, but ideally, we want to point out that, we have been acquired by Alliance, great partnership, great organization, great corporation, lots of room to grow for both sides. So again, the my email has changed, as you can certainly see. So what's on the agenda for today? I want to give a very, very brief overview for, even if you're an existing customer, just an introduction to QAI, just a couple of slides, overview for new and old users. And then we're just going to go right into, talking about the QAI features and bug fixes that we have done. And then lastly, of course, we'll have some additional questions at the end. So again, like Reagan pointed out, feel free to go ahead and chat and type your questions in the chat. But if I'll probably get to them at the end, more than likely. So again, introduction to QAI. So, what is QAI used for? In developing this product, one thing I always sort of think about, we have another product, Flex Reports, that lots of times I'm dealing with sending stuff over to an EMIS. Well, QAI is, the one thing it does really good is it's all about tracking that QA test activity, those workflows. When is that next test? When is that report due? Who's responsible for performing the test or, turning in that report? The other big thing is displaying those operating hours in the other parameter groups. StackVision 7.7, one of the features is we're going to be adding more things than just, your stack operating hours. And lastly, sending out those emails, notifying people of, hey, I just hit 168. I got a linearity coming up. Where am I at with that? So what is QAI not used for? So it doesn't track anything historically, doesn't generate any real file types for XML, JSON, anything like that you're going to use for submittals. It's not a document repository. It doesn't actually, you're not performing any QA tests in QAI. Again, it's just a tracker creating that workflow so you can track it along those cycles to make sure that you're hitting your deadlines. Doesn't track out of control status. And QAI, I just mentioned the operating hours. QAI doesn't calculate that. The DAS handles that. The DAS is still the source of the truth in this particular situation. So the DAS is, figuring out, based off your operating hours, your stack or your gas, in the case of, transmitters, transducers, PEI tests, it already has that information in its wheelhouse, and it's using that to figure out when is that next test due. So QAI is not really a calculation engine right now. Again, it's primarily used for tracking and notification and just keeping you informed of when things are due and whose job is it to do them. And then lastly, some of the things I want to touch over is the workflow. We'll talk about workflows significantly because we made a lot of feature enhancements around them. So with the workflows, what it is you have a workflow that's associated with a facility and a source and an actual test activity and maybe a linearity, something like that. And then you have the cycle range, right? The cycle range is, well, hey, I have to do all these various activities within this period. So like I mentioned before, sorry, there's some people chatting. So as I mentioned before, you hit that 168 operating hours, within that quarter, you're going to have, hey, I need to go out and get my linearity test done. I have to draft a report. Maybe you have an internal group that needs to be reviewed by. And then lastly, that final regulatory report you either submit to your state or the federal agencies. So, just a brief introduction of, those various workflow types. Reoccurring workflows, pretty simplistic. One test if you pass that test, the next test is going to be based off the prior activity. Recurring calendar based workflows. So those are when they're periodically assigned based on the data. I mean, a really good example is, EDRs, right? Like, you always know that once the quarter ends, you have 30 days to submit your EDRs to be in the clear. And then imported tests. So again, those are sort of controlled by the DAS, where it's automatically figuring out the next test due dates, importing that automatically over into your QAI system. User initiated tasks. So you may have one user passes a task to another user. Certification events is another really big one. And again, one reason I wanted to highlight this is we made a lot of improvements to these workflow types to make it easier for the user. So a certification event, you can think of that as like a super workflow that may generate others, right? Because if your umbilical goes out, you know that, hey, you're going to have to put in a certification event for, ECMPS 1 or 2, depending on how things play out this year or next year. So if you're replacing umbilical, you're going to need to do a linearity, a cycle time test, 7-day cal. All those spawn off other events that are separate but all related because you had to do this one certification event. So again, that's a very high level overview of just sort of what QAI is. And you'll be able to see a lot more as we are progressing through this application or this presentation. So, again, the overall goal of the 2.0 features was, it was a very polished product, but it had some quirks here and there. There were some things that weren't necessarily easy enough for the end user to figure out or even see, right? Like I mentioned before, certification events, right? Like, it'd be really nice if, when that certification event came in, we know what tests are due. So we should automatically spawn off those recert events. So, we took much more of a zero configuration approach to things. In the current implementation, it would be implementation engineers or support even going in and configuring all these plan sources, parameters, facilities, and things like that. That really shouldn't be on us. It should really be, available to you guys. Let's be honest, let's make it as easy as possible for you guys to add new sources. Because, as I read almost every day, there's one power company or one equity firm's buying a fleet of plants. So, you may be adding or removing sites, more than frequently. So we want to make that as easy as possible for you guys. Another big one is, sometimes in QAI, you would have to, click and you'd be adding something and you may, have to walk away for a little bit and you come back and you wouldn't exactly remember where you were at. So supplying the metadata that, hey, where you can walk away from the computer, come back and say, oh, I know exactly where I'm at. What am I doing? To be able to make it a little bit easier to the user to say, oh, okay, I can assign this because I know I'm working on a RADA or a particular test type. So, by adding a lot of features, we actually didn't have to fix that many bugs by streamlining it, making it easier to use, giving the user the ability to remove things, reset things, add things on their own. So that helps, not only you guys, but helps us too, because we're not generating support calls. So again, throughout this presentation, I just like to keep in mind, remember back to my, those first few slides, remember what QAI is and remember what it isn't. And it's a great tool for tracking notification, and it's really easy to deploy now. I actually have a customer that's getting ready to add a couple sites. And, in doing that, I actually told him, well, yeah, we can probably get support to do that. But here in a week, if you want to, do this yourself, you're going to have the ability. So, it's really good to, have complete product knowledge in your hands and not, rely on us necessarily to do those types of things. So from a internal perspective, a lot of these are wins for both you and us. So we're going to get right into it. Most of these are pretty straightforward. We're not going to spend too much time. QAI server, the installation just didn't work with a local account. So what did we do? We fixed that so it worked with a local account. Pretty self-explanatory. So, we do have customers that wanted to use local accounts. So, this was a pretty obvious and easy to implement fix with the installer. The last run date for a report didn't always update. So the last run date is this this section over here on the right side that when you run a report in the client, you can see the last time that report was run wasn't updating. What did we do? Well, we fixed it so it updated. Import service fails when a unsupported file exists in the directory. So we had a case where for some reason in their import directory a file that wasn't an XML file got in there and it caused all kinds of problems, and nobody really knew till they had to log into the server and look at the log file. So that really shouldn't happen. We know QAI only reads XML files, so obviously we need to be more cognizant of that. So the import service will ignore any file that isn't an XML file in that import directory. Again, cleaning and refining the product. It allowed you to make duplication, duplicate parameters, duplicate workspaces, which is the next item we're going to talk about. But we added some more validation to tell the user, hey, you can't do this because it already exists. So again, by fixing some of these bugs, we're eliminating others. I mentioned before, workflows, you really shouldn't have duplicate workflows, because then when that QAI file comes into the QAI, how does it know which workflow does it go to? And it can cause confusion and has led to support cases. So again, we just enforce validation. Very simple approach. So completed recert event workflows displays data banner for previous selected workflows until refresh. So again here, just minor tweaks, just an unnoticed bug where it could be misleading to the user. You click one workflow, but you're seeing something else somewhere else. So we redefine that. We added a refresh button there just in case as well, but keeping things in sync. So again, as you can see, there weren't too many bugs with QAI. A lot of it we chose to improve through feature enhancements. And these are just a list of some of the feature enhancements that we touched. We touched some on administration, a lot in workflows, user security and email, imported tests, parameter groups, which we'll get into. And I sort of alluded to this before, certification and recert events. So, the overall goal of the 2.0 features was to provide the user with less setup, automatically import the sources and parameters based off the XML file. So again, we sort of took a zero configuration approach, because, even internally, I've been trying to do more and more demos with customers. And one thing is that, hey, if you're a StackVision user and you have StackVision installed, you have the ability already with QA test deadlines report to generate the QAI XML file. So with that, if you wanted to do a demo of, a couple facilities within your fleet, we can just ask you, hey, do you mind to set up your QAI XML file? You can give those to us. We can import those in automatically now. There's really no setup, and we can demo it to you. So it's a really good tool, not only, for internally, externally, but, for other groups within our corporation now, where we can highlight and show you your data in the product that you're considering buying. So again, I think that's a very win-win-win internally and externally. Really helps sales and marketing, relate to the product you get to see your data as well as, understand how that workflow would work in your organization. As I mentioned before, a lot of that metadata, not having to switch back and forth between tabs, simplifying that. It was a relatively simple workflow process, but simplifying it, redesigning it a little bit more, so you had a little bit more visibility into what you're doing. And as I mentioned, remember what QAI is and remember what it's not. So, getting right into it, administration, one of the very first things I noticed was in the parameters, where's the facility, right? So we added the facility in there so you can see, your facility, your parameters and your sources all together like you're pretty much used to in the DAS. The next was user security and email. User can be subscribed to notified when to assign who, they can be notified when they're assigned now, which is a big win. Again, we want this to be as seamless as possible. So here's an example of users and groups under the admins user security emails page. So you have an assign on notify, and alternatively, it may be that, hey, you obviously, if you don't want to have to do something, you want to be notified that you're not doing it anymore, right? So now you have the ability to, if you're assigned something, you'll get a notification if you have email set up. And conversely, if you're unassigned a task, you'll get notification. So here's an example of that where an email was sent when they were assigned or unassigned. So again, a lot of metadata surrounding that to make sure that the user knows what they've been assigned or what they've been unassigned as well. So they shouldn't necessarily, they can read that all from the email and understand exactly what's happening. Imported tests, add user interface to delete the workflow cycles, workflow groups, workflow items, and workflow tests. Again, like I mentioned before, we would sometimes get obscure cases from support where we would have to go into the database and run some queries and figure out, there's a duplicate workflow. We shouldn't allow that. Or, there's a workflow that they created the workflow before they created the parameter, so it doesn't know what to do. Well, now, rather than having to call support, we can walk you through, or you can still call support, obviously. But the ability to delete right from the imported test, all the things associated with that, and sort of do a reset and then re-import. So that gives you the ability to find and to delete those test activity, those various groups, the cycles that are built in from that imported test. So this allows the user to fix any of those erroneous tests that would normally cause workflow issues, and again, potentially would lead to support calls. So again, here's an example of a user deleting the workflow test or deleting a cycle, everything associated with the imported test. Parameters. So this was a very big win, in my opinion, for everybody. I've already harped on it 100 times. I'm so excited about it. Is creating sources and parameters from the import XML file. Like if all that information is already in the file, why are you having to go create it in QAI? Just let QAI create it itself. So it's sort of like you set up your system. Again, I mentioned this with the sales calls and doing sales demos. You send us the QAI XML file, we can stand up your system within an hour to demo it for you. So that makes it really easy for you if you're adding new sources, or I should say, if you're adding facilities to your portfolio and you want to bring those facilities into QAI, now that makes it a very simple process. As long as you can have that QAI XML file, QAI will automatically read that in. Anything that's not already existing will merge into that particular system. So it's really, really a win-win for everybody here. So again, you can sort of control that by allow the automatic object creation box. And again, what that does is when it detects, you're importing a file and it sees something that it didn't have before, it's going to go automatically create that for you. So you will know you really don't have to, go in there and create sites and sources and things like that if you're using the QAI XML file approach. Startup sessions. So now you have the ability where you can actually filter out particular facilities. So in those various site IDs in the startup sessions, so if you want to only allow a user, say you have a east and a west fleet, I'll just simplify it down. You can say, your east person only sees the east sites, your west person only sees the west sites. So it allows more filterability and narrows that focus, especially if you have a large fleet. This makes a lot of sense. Test quarantine. So again, test quarantine is one of those areas where you sort of, as a customer, you probably sat there and stared at it and wasn't exactly sure what quarantine means, because we've all been accustomed to virus scans, and anything in quarantine can't be good, right? So we're going to provide you a little bit more information, and how you can create a workflow from quarantine. We added a little quarantine wizard, test quarantine wizard. So, hey, I haven't seen this test before. What do you want to do with it? Let's create a new workflow from that. Because remember, QAI can do the import of the sources, the parameters, and things like that, but it's not going to necessarily create the workflow behind that. So again, what we did is sort of created a more streamlined approach for creating a workflow. Gives detailed information about, hey, this test, what's in this test, right? You're not reading the XML file. You may not know what RADA it is, but it sort of provides that information. Like I said before, this is the metadata that you're using to create the test. So having that alongside, not having to click back and forth various areas, makes it a lot easier. Activities. So increase the visibility of activities and page and displayed items. So here's in the previous release we had due date, and yet we still have color coding, even though in the next slide I forgot to include it. But the activity page before only display activities on which the due dates were less than or equal to the current quarter, right? So you were, again, QAI is really focused on what's happening now, right? And again, it was ultra focused because it was only in the current quarter or greater, right? So now, you have the ability to sort of change that around where you can see stuff way in the future, that you're not as restrictive anymore. So again, you can see upcoming due dates, all those cycle ranges, and things like that. Startup sessions. So again, this was a feature that is accessible under administration and startup sessions. And what it's really used for, it allows them to edit and set defaults for startup sessions, right? So they can create a startup session, export that out, throw that on another client, and then when that client loads, you get the same thing every time. We have customers that sort of have kiosks that are very hands-off. This will be very handy in doing those. And again, we give you the ability to view, edit, delete, set those sessions, and test connections with those sessions. And I just mentioned the import and the export of those sessions. So one of the things I noticed in the administration page was there was coming soon pages. I said, well, we better do it because, we can't have coming soon forever. That just kind of looks bad. So what we did is we added a little bit of enhancements for the reports. So you can view, edit, and add reports into your client. Option to reorder those reports, filter out particular active, inactive reports, and it tracks those changes via the audit log as well. So here's an example of adding a new report. Service configuration. So again, another big one here is the email, username, password, all that information. We sort of centralize that into the product, and now it's actually obfuscated there, which means you can't see the password and all that any longer. So this was not only as a just needed to be done for ease of use and conformity along the product, but solving a couple of security bugs on the way. I think this actually a customer had actually said, "Hey, I need this blanked out. My IT group would, you know, hit the fan if they saw this." And I said, "Well, I already got you." So, it was already implemented in QAI 2.0. Very happy to sort of get ahead of the curve on that. Administration, as I mentioned before, a lot of this um, auto generated from the QAI XML file that gets pushed out from the DAS. But you may have a situation where you're adding a facility that either doesn't have Stack Vision currently or doesn't have a DAS. Maybe it's a lab or something like that. You just want to, track test in QAI with that. Well, you need the ability to, add that from the admin page. So if we look at, admin administration and then the sites page, you can actually go in there and create those workflow sites. So again, you have the view, you can view the active sites, you can search the sites, refresh the sites as well. So again, we're giving you the ability to create your own sites and sources and things like that on your own now, which again, leads to less support calls, less time you waiting on us. So it's a win-win-win. Workflow sites configuration page, again, add, edit, and add new sites. So here's an example of sort of walking you through the site objects, whereas before you couldn't do that. You would have to call support. We would have to go in there and add it in the database. Not ideal, obviously. Activities, add workflow cycle date ranges on the activities page. So again, this makes a lot of sense, right? Like you have your activities page, but maybe you want to see, well, hey, how much time do I have left, right? When's the, you know, when do I have to complete all these activities? So exposing that metadata, which already existed in the UI, to give you a better idea of, hey, these things are really coming up. So again, that sort of correlates to the colors on the left hand side. Yeah, it's opposite. Edit and cancel activities in multiple cycles. So, we give you the ability to sort of edit and cancel these cycles. So a warning notification allow the options to save or discard changes on those various workflow cycles. So, before you could go back and forth and you wouldn't even know that you had a pending save. So again, refining the product a little bit more, providing more information to the user about, hey, you're about to leave this page. Are you sure you don't want to save your changes? Allow edits to the workflow name without having to stop and start. So again, this just seemed like pretty obvious thing to do. There's not a tie in the back end or anything like that to the name. So why should you have to stop and start the workflow service, lose the metadata associated with it? We're just going to allow you to edit the name of the test. So now you can edit it without having to stop and start your workflows. And that one little feature we've enhanced probably solved 3 or 4 different bugs we've heard from different customers where, hey, I really want to stop and start this, or hey, I did stop this because I couldn't edit the name otherwise, but they didn't understand that they lost all that metadata associated with the workflow when that happens. So again, streamlining functionality, making it easier for you guys and us. Workflows, add activity status colors to the workflow page. So that again, that sort of gives you the ability to identify those status workflows activities, adding some color. So just like we saw on the dashboard, you have colors, you can have activity colors within the workflow that say, hey, these things are due soon, reds are past due, right? So here's an example of, these things are past due. Better support for advanced filtering. So giving you the ability to sort of look within the date ranges on some of these to try to improve the visibility. Again, I'm all about providing you with all the metadata in a clear and concise format so you're not having to hunt around when things are due. Improve support for recertification events by grouping with the certification event. So, again, this was probably my second or third big win for QAI was, when you do a certification event, what other things come across with it, right? So again, we know these types and these events. These are hard coded into ECMPS. It's a set list of things. So that same information that you put in the DAS comes over in the XML file. The metadata is exposed, so you can say, hey, this I know exactly what this is, right? This comes over, and I can see, if I was to sort of drill down into these, it groups them, right? So, I know for this particular certification event, I have to go in and do a 7-day cal. I'm going to have to do a cycle time and things like that. So, it sort of groups all that together. So it's what I like to call it the mega workflow, because really it's a workflow that kicks off other workflows. Reports. So, again, here we made some, very minimalistic, but hopefully changes that, you guys will appreciate. And obviously some of you have asked for them, hey, you left out location type in the reports. I'd like to be able to see stack, duct, etc. So we added that column to all these, the activities report, the facility activities report, the facility report, and lastly, the workflow configuration. So this is, I have three big things for QAI, but this was like another major win, I thought, for you guys and QAI is, the DAS, as I mentioned before, the DAS is the one doing all the calculations for the next test due date. It knows your gas op hours, your operating hours, things like that, uses all that, has a calculation engine, figures out when that next test is due, right? But that data is still important, right? And there's data outside stack and gas that we all have configured on our DAS, like startups and shutdowns, those basic time online parameters, right? So, in Stack Vision, we have parameter groups, and those parameter groups are tied to pretty much a fuel type or a operating condition. And those are just counts of the data. So you'll see startups and shutdowns, and people use that to figure out, okay, they may have a hard limit. There's limits in some states of how many stop or how many starts you can have in a particular quarter, year, etc. So providing you again some of this metadata. None of this data is used for anything in QAI, but now you have the ability to see all those various parameter groups across your entire fleet. Obviously, that's a lot of information. So what we also did is we said by default, we're going to group by facility and source. But again, like I mentioned before, it sort of gives you an overview of this is what's configured in my DAS. I can track that across my entire fleet now. So it opens up the doors for, figuring out which units are, having the most stops and starts, gas, oil, all these various operating conditions and or fuel types that you can configure in the DAS and track. So again, with that, obviously we couldn't stop there. We got to give you the ability that if you're not importing it from the XML file, maybe you just want to have it and create one yourself, you can now go in and configure parameter groups from the client. And again, that's under administration parameter groups. You have the ability to add, edit, delete those new parameter groups. And I just mentioned this as before, adding all that information in potentially would have been very overwhelming, right? But when you filter by facility, or you group by facility and source, it gives you probably the best fleet-wide view of, hey, these are the various, uh, per facility, per source. These are all of my various operating conditions and fuel types configured in the DAS. So again, these are all the uh, um, op hours is just greater than 0. It's not operating time. So these are just counts greater than 1. Filter based off the lead in the activities group. I really like this one. Um, Having a report where you can just say, well, hey, for this particular facility or the entire fleet, who's assigned, how many people or this person's assigned what, right? So you can go through and say, pick your leads out there, and you get a report that only includes them. And obviously, conversely, probably more important is, who did I forget to assign something, right? So, giving you the ability to assign, unassign, and view and have more visibility into who is doing what, is always a very, very good approach. So again here, it's a new report parameter that has no lead assigned, and then for all your various users in QAI, you can select those as well. Parameters, add a refresh button. Oops, my little square's off, but top left corner up here, we added a refresh button just in case things get out of sync or something like that. So now you can refresh and view automatically added sources and parameters. Like I mentioned before, you may, for some reason, have this page open because it's awesome, I guess. And somebody may be importing a new site, and you need to refresh to make sure that came in. You don't even have to leave the page now. That button's there available for you. Improve date input validation to better convey a warning. So again, this is more of a UI related thing, but providing visibility to the user that, hey, the warning date's outside, you're scheduling this test outside the cycle. Are you sure you want to do that? Right? Like, it's going to allow you to do it. You may have a good reason to do that, but it's going to give you a warning telling you, hey, you're outside of the cycle range. Not, we're giving you the metadata to help you describe why this is a warning. Certification events, import service and import source for the certification events. Again, sort of here, zero config approach. If you have a cert event in your XML file and for some reason those sources didn't exist, maybe you're adding a new one, QAI, if it comes from that XML file, will automatically create those for you. Import service, and this is where I really, really, really liked our approach was, we know the cert event. The cert event clearly dictates what recert events are required. I mentioned before, linearity, 7-day cal, cycle time. Now, when that cert event comes over, if you didn't have a recert event, it will automatically create those recert event workflows for you. So you automatically get, your 7-day, your cycle time, your linearity, and RADA. I left out RADA. I'm sorry. That's bad because we're stack tested. So again, I think that's a very big win, making it streamlined, making it smart. I mean, it's a great idea, and it makes it seem like the product's a much more enterprise level product when it just does things because it knows what it needs to do. So here's an example of auto-created workflow cert events. So you can see, all that information about that metadata surrounding, how much operating time do I have left? And that can be in days, hours, etc., depending on the cert event. So lastly, questions, and I do see a couple. I have one question um, so far. So
Yes,
one of the questions, you want to go ahead, Reagan?
you got it.
Okay. So can QA track non-stack version, non-SIMS activity workflows such as a preventative maintenance schedule elsewhere in the plant? Right. So again, we do have workflows that can be user initiated, calendar based, and I did mention now you have the ability to add your own sites. So it may not be as complex a thing like a rata linearity. Hopefully, you do have a Stack Vision DAS to be able to do that. We are exploring a couple different ways to do that from a non-Stack Vision SIM, non-Stack Vision approach. But we do have a customer that's adding a lab to track tests. So again, labs aren't going to necessarily have Stack Vision installed, or a Sims in general, or a DAS. But yes, to answer your question, it may not obviously not have the full functionality of some of those other tracking, but you can do some of those workflow types, and have those user initiated, calendar based reoccurring workflows. You would just put in a new source. Hey, this is my lab. I expect to get these tests every 2 weeks or something like that. Sorbent traps. I don't know. Something like that. I appreciate the question. Right. Okay. So one question is, can QAI link to the logbook to trigger events? Um, the QAI is not aware of the logbook currently, but that's a really good point because, lots of people are starting to track more and more changes, cylinder switches and things like that go to the logbook. And we've made a lot of improvements in the DAS to, sort of track those and keep them in the logbook. Right now, QAI is not, I will say, logbook aware, but that's definitely something we can look into and consider as a feature.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Good to see you, everybody.